Hello and welcome back to 9.4 Radio, your radio home of 9.4 Coaching. This is episode 2. I am Sarah Skedsvold, and today we're going to talk about the book Tribe by Sebastian Junger. This is going to be the format going forward for the most part. I'm going to dig into a book that I've found really impactful in my life, how it relates to building strong communities and how it relates to developing capable humans. I'm going to dip into the text, and I'm going to riff a little bit and tell you why it means something to me and why I believe it means something to building strong communities. I will try to denote when I'm reading and when I'm riffing, but I imagine it'll be pretty obvious. So let's kick it off. The book Tribe by Sebastian Junger is about homecoming, and it's about tribal cultures, and it's about soldiers. There are pieces and parts of the book that I'm not going to get into. There's some really good information about post-traumatic stress. There's some really good case studies about different leadership styles. I'm going to really stick with building strong communities, with what I believe is good for what I'm looking for. This book, I could spend hours on it, but I'm trying to keep the podcast to 20 minutes and all that good stuff. So that's just a disclaimer. Not to say that I won't check it out in the future. I won't go back to it, but for today, it's going to be a really, really brief overview. And it's the good stuff that I found super, super useful. So buckle up. Let's get into it. Sebastian talks about in the introduction that this book is based on an article he did for Vanity Fair back in June 2015, which was called "How PTSD Became a Problem Far Beyond the Battlefield." Sebastian does have 2 TED Talks, one from 2014 and one from 2016, and they're really along the same lines. Sebastian is a battlefield correspondent, and he has been embedded with combat units, and he has seen the beauty and the tragedy of combat. So he's an amazing writer, and he paints an amazing picture, and he's been there. So he's an amazing advocate for the fundamental of what I would consider our humanity. And it's a fantastic book. His TED Talks are great. The TED Talks are Why Veterans Miss War, and Our Lonely Society Makes It Hard to Come Home from War. So as you can see, there's a legitimate trend there. And you can see why it appeals to me too. I want to build strong communities where people feel belonging, and they feel trusted, and they feel loved, and they feel celebrated, and they know they can go to each other in times of crisis. And Sebastian talks about where that exists. And it's always been my belief that if we can find a bright spot, if we can find something where the ideal exists, we just need to replicate it, right? So I'm going to get into the book. In the introduction, Sebastian talks about he was a young man trying to find his way. In normal tribes, you find there is a ceremony that a man has to go through to go from boy to man. In affluent, mid to high wealth society out in New England where he was, you just don't have that, right? So he was determined to trek across hitchhike across the United States out to California. And he talks about that in a little bit of detail. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the introduction. He talks about an encounter with a man who he doesn't know, he's never seen again, and how this brief encounter actually did shape the way that he saw the world. So into the book. The man said he lived in a broken down car and that every morning he walked miles to a coal mine outside of town to see if they need a fill-in work. Some days they did, some days they didn't. And this was one of the days that they didn't. So I won't be needing this, he said, opening his black lunchbox. I saw you from town and I just wanted to come out here and make sure you were okay. The lunchbox contained a bologna sandwich, an apple, and a bag of potato chips. The food had probably come from a local church. I had no choice but to take it. I thanked him and put the food in my pack for later and wished him luck. Then he turned and made his way back down to an on-ramp towards Gillette. I thought about that man the rest of my trip. I thought about him for the rest of my life. He'd been generous, yes, but a lot of people were generous. What made him different was the fact that he had taken responsibility for me. He had spotted me from town and walked half a mile out of his way to make sure that I was okay. Robert Frost famously wrote that home is a place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. The word tribe is far harder to define, but a start might be people you feel compelled to share the last year food with. For reasons I'll never know, the man in Gillette decided to treat me like a member of his tribe. He talks about the book and the sentiment and modern society, and it's about what we can learn from tribal societies, about loyalty and belonging and the internal human quest for meaning. And that struck me. That's why I get up in the morning, is I want my life to have meaning, and I'm sure that you feel the exact same way. Back into the book, humans don't mind hardship. In fact, they thrive on it. What they mind is not feeling necessary. Modern society has perfected the art of making people not feel necessary. It's time for that to end. And I totally agreed. I'm 5 pages into Tribe. I've dedicated the first, at least third of this podcast, and I've only got through the introduction of this book. And that's really the thesis, is that we don't mind working hard as long as what we're doing is worthy. It's a worthwhile cause, right? And I'm going to get into how to get back in touch with that, because I guarantee none of us are going back to the Stone Age. None of us we're not going to give up our jobs. We're not going to give up our affluence. But it doesn't mean that we can't also pick up our humanity. Going forward in the book, Sebastian talks about modern society. I'm going to jump a little bit further into the book. If you're taking notes, if you're following along in your own copy, we're at page 18. First, agriculture and then industry changed two fundamental things about the human experience. The accumulation of personal property allowed people to make more and more individualistic choices about their lives, and those choices unavoidably diminished group efforts toward a common good. And that's a big deal. I mean, we've been slowly walking away from tribal society for a lot of years, and he talks about that just in industry and agriculture, right? We have boxes to check, and we have schedules to maintain, we have times to do things, and a lot of it's based on individual timelines. He talks later in the book where if you're in an affluent society, you can walk through your entire life every day and just interact with strangers. That's a thing that people do. It blows my mind. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine living in a community where someone didn't know my name, right? Even if they didn't like me all the time, they recognize me. I go to a handful of coffee shops here in Fargo, and one of the big reasons that I like going to the same coffee shops is I like being recognized. I like being recognized, and I like recognizing people too. You develop that relationship in, 3 to 5 minute interactions, and you'd be surprised how much you can learn about somebody, or how much belonging you can feel when you have those 3 to 5 minute interactions. It boggles my mind. Diving a little bit further into the book, he talks about the self-determination theory, and that's a big one, especially when we're talking about people trying to find meaning. That quest for meaning in their lives. And he talks later in the book. We're looking at page 22-ish. There's a lot of really good stuff, just in this part of the book. But the self-determination theory basically states that people want to feel competent at what they do. They want to feel authentic in their lives, and they want to be connected to others. And if you're missing any of those parts, something's missing. Like, you can feel something's missing. And even if you don't allow yourself to recognize it, your body still feels it. I lived this life. I imagine that if you really stopped and thought about it, you have too, in some way, shape, or form. I've put in a lot of work to get on the other side of it and find alignment with those 3 components of self-determination. And I tell you what, right now, I feel a lot better. I do. There was a time, I was always competent, and I worked real hard to be competent. Some of it came easy, but even if it came easy, it was work. Especially in my military career, especially in my academic career, I always wanted to be competent. That's what I hung my hat on. I always wanted to be looked to as someone who knows what they're doing. And if I didn't know what I was doing, I was going to put the work in to figure it out. I strove and I achieved for a long time feeling authentic in what I was doing. And the military makes it very easy to be around people, and it oftentimes hardship makes it easy to feel connected to others. Once I didn't feel authentic and once I didn't feel connected, that's when I could see a huge downturn. I was always competent. I was always doing a good job, but that's when I didn't feel connected and I didn't feel authentic, and then I didn't like where I was, and I changed it. I was very fortunate to be able to do that, and that's a huge part of being a strong person, is recognizing what you're missing and looking for tools to generate authenticity, to generate connectedness, and then to find action steps to take to make it happen. I had left my full-time career with the North Dakota Army National Guard with 16 years of full-time service. So I was 4 years away from a full military retirement. And because of my authenticity, in what I was doing and my connectedness, I willingly walked away. And I will tell you every day that it has been worth it. It has not always been easy, but it has always been worth it. And when I read, when I was reading Tribe for the very first time, I was still in the military. And that resonated. It dropped a seed. And the next time I read it, it was more resounding. And now as I read it again, I feel so much better. I feel great that I feel like I am connected to others. I feel like I am authentic in my life. And I feel I'm competent at what I'm doing. Even learning podcasting, don't get me wrong, and learning blogging, I feel competent. I feel good. This is the right thing. So if you're out there and you're struggling, just know that really sit down and think about how you're feeling in those 3 areas: competency, authenticity, and connectedness, and do something about it. Look at where you're weak and make yourself strong. And I hope that my blogs and these podcasts and eventually seminars and one-on-one coaching and workshops, they're going to give you the tools to make that happen so that you feel fully self-actualized and feeling good and like doing good things. So I'm going to move deeper into the book. And it talks about, I'm going to skip a lot of the book. I'm going to get into why soldiers miss war, and then a really amazing case study of what a strong community can look like in the private sector, in a business setting. And it's really amazing. So diving deeper into the book, we're going to go all the way to page 91. So, into the book. Any discussion of veterans and their common experience of alienation must address the fact that so many soldiers find themselves missing the war after it's over. That troubling fact can be found in written accounts from war after war, country after country. As awkward as it is to say, part of the trauma of war seems to be giving it up. For the first time in our lives, we were in a tribal sort of situation where we could help each other without fear. That's a quote from a former gunner of the 62nd Coast Artillery, talking about an oral history from the book The Good War. That's it. That's a strong community. When you are in a military unit and you are facing hardship, you're gonna fall apart or you're gonna come together. That is a microcosm, just like how I talked about coaching as a microcosm of like relating with people. Facing hardships when you can't leave each other physically, that will bring you together or it will tear you apart. And the more difficult the hardship, the stronger the bonds. And Sebastian talks about that. He talks about the fact that during amazing hardships, during some of the worst times in a soldier's life, that's why they miss it, is because there's always somebody around and there's always someone feeling that same hardship. So if you go to work and your coworkers, you are together just for that work day, right? And then you leave, and if you don't feel connected to anybody else, you could be having completely different experiences outside of the work setting. And if you don't have that connectedness, it's going to be really, really difficult to create that strong bond. Military service is a very complex experience, and I know that firsthand. It was absolutely some of the best times that I've experienced. It was some of the greatest sense of meaning that I've ever had, where I have seen my actions help somebody else out in a real big way, and it was amazing. We don't have that here in a lot of ways. And the more that we can look at cultivating that, the bigger deal it's going to be. So to transition, a very good case study, a very good example of how this applies to a private sector setting, right? I just talked about a lot of military service and how it creates this shared hardship, it creates this strong community. This is an absolute validated case study of how this can translate into a private sector, into business. So into the book. In late 2015, while finishing this book, I saw a family notice in the New York Times for a man named Martin H. Bauman, who died peacefully at the age of 85. The notice explained that Mr. Bauman had joined the Army in the 1950s, contracted polio while in the service, graduated college under the GI Bill, and eventually started a successful job placement firm in New York City. The firm found people for top executive positions around the country, but that didn't protect it from economic downturns. In the 1990s, Bauman's company experienced its first money-losing year in 3 decades. According to the Times notice, Mr. Bauman called his employees into a meeting and asked them to accept a 10% reduction in salary so that he wouldn't have to fire anybody. They all agreed. Then he quietly decided to give up his personal salary until his company was back on safe ground. The only reason the staff found out was because the company bookkeeper told them. Bauman obviously felt that true leadership, the kind that lives depend on, may require powerful people to put themselves last, and that he was one of those people. That's a big deal. Coming out of the book, that's a huge deal, and we will see it in some of the books that I actually the next podcast that I go over when I talk about the book Leaders Eat Last. You're gonna see that it wasn't self-sacrificing. He asked all of his people to share in a common hardship, and he felt responsible for taking care of his people, and he gave up his personal salary. Now, I don't know what kind of hardship that put himself into, but I will 100% say that everyone working for Mr. Bauman, I imagine, respected the hell out of him. That's a person that you will follow. That's a strong community. I guarantee every one of those employees looked across the room and they said, if you're gonna sacrifice 10% of your income, then I will too. And sharing that hardship drew them closer. So it's possible, and that was one example. We're gonna find more examples in the future. So I'm gonna wrap this up. We're at a little over 20 minutes. I really, really recommend diving into the book Tribe by Sebastian. It's a phenomenal book. He's an amazing writer. It's a really short book. It's about 130 pages, but there's a lot of really good information. There's a lot. It's not dense in the fact that you can't understand it. He does an amazing job of taking a lot of nerdery and a lot of science-y writing, and he tells you up front that he is going to write a book that is easier to read, right? So there's source notes, there's PDFs available, there's all that good stuff. For a 135-page book, there's a lot of information, and it paints a very vivid picture. So shoot me a comment on the podcast if you like it, if you want to hear more about it. There are a lot of case studies about leadership styles, tribal living, and post-traumatic stress disorder recovery in this book. I gave you a 30,000 foot view, and really just stuck to the tactical tips and perspectives for developing strong people, developing strong communities. So go ahead and leave a comment. Go ahead and share this with your friends. We're just gonna be building from here on out. These podcasts are gonna launch during the week. I know I launched my introduction on a weekend, and that was just to get it out there. These future podcasts are gonna launch during the week. I really recommend, if you want to keep track of what's going on, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And we'll see you next time. Have a great day.